We begin tonight, of course, with the breaking news about the testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who will testify in a closed-door deposition tomorrow in the impeachment investigation of Donald Trump. NBC News has obtained a copy of Colonel Vindman's opening statement tomorrow, in which he explains that he was listening to Donald Trump's phone call with the president of Ukraine. He says, "I was concerned by the call. I did not think it was proper to demand that a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen, and I was worried about the implications for the U.S. government's support of Ukraine. Following the call, I again reported my concerns to NSC's lead counsel, that would be John Eisenberg. Colonel Vindman stresses that he personally has had no direct contact or communication with President Trump. And he also says he is not the whistleblower. He says, I want the committees to know I am not the whistleblower who brought this issue to the CIA and the committee's attention. I do not know who the whistleblower is, and I would not feel comfortable to speculate as to the identity of the whistleblower." Colonel Vindman begins his opening statement with some basic biographical information. He says, "I have dedicated my entire professional life to the United States of America for more than 2 decades. It has been my honor to serve as an officer in the United States Army. As an infantry officer, I served multiple overseas tours, including South Korea and Germany, and a deployment to Iraq for combat operations in Iraq. I was wounded in an IED attack and awarded a Purple Heart. Since 2008, I have been a foreign area officer specializing in Eurasia. In this role, I have served in the United States embassies in Kiev, Ukraine, and Moscow, Russia. In July 2018, I was asked to serve at the National Security Council. I sit here as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, an immigrant. My family fled the Soviet Union when I was 3.5 years old. Upon arriving in New York City in 1979, my father worked multiple jobs to support us, all the while learning English at night. He stressed to us the importance of fully integrating into our adopted country. I have a deep appreciation for American values and ideals and the power of freedom. I am a patriot, and it is my sacred duty and honor to advance and defend our country, irrespective of party or politics." And leading off our breaking news discussion tonight from Kiev, Ukraine, is NBC News reporter Josh Lederman, national reporter for NBC News. Also joining us, former ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul, who knows Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, Evelyn Farkas, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration, and Jonathan Alter is with us. He's a columnist for the Daily Beast. And Ambassador McFaul, let me start with you. What should we know about Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman?
Well, we served together in Moscow when I was the ambassador. He was part of the military attaches there. You read a lot of it already, and I was always struck, as I always am, the people that go to serve overseas in those embassies, especially the military attaches, but actually not especially, all of them, they're the best and the brightest. They're the people that are most committed to the cause. Alexander, Colonel Vindman, had another piece of his biography, as you read, that he is an immigrant from that part of the world. And in my experience working in the government, there's something about the immigrants that join the U.S. government and serve in the military. They are even more committed to the cause. You know, he's a loyal patriot. I have no idea if he's a Democrat or Republican, and there would be no reason that that would ever come up. And another thing, I also worked at the White House. I want to underscore, I was a senior director there for 3 years, and I had people like Colonel Vindman that work for me. Remember, they're also the best and the brightest that get detailed to work at the National Security Council. He is definitely one of those people.
And Josh Lederman, in Ukraine tonight, we were going to lead this hour with your reporting from Ukraine, which reveals that the White House, people in the White House, in John Bolton's arena of the White House, knew about the pressure that Rudy Giuliani was putting on Ukraine earlier than we thought in May. How is Colonel Vindman's statement tonight linking up with your reporting?
I got to tell you, something that really jumped out to me in reading that statement tonight, Lawrence, was the fact that he says that he began to understand as early as the spring that what he describes as outside influencers were getting involved in Ukraine policy in a way that was contrary to U.S. national security interests. That links up very well with what we are reporting at NBC News tonight, which is that as early as mid-May, long before had previously been known, Fiona Hill, a top official at the White House, had been notified that President Zelensky, just barely taking office as the new president here in Ukraine, was concerned and rattled by this pressure campaign from Rudy Giuliani and Ambassador Sondland. So we're getting a much bigger and broader picture, consistent from multiple people who are coming forward, describing a pressure campaign that started early and that was clear to the Ukrainians that they were going to have to do what Rudy Giuliani wanted if they were going to have the type of relationship with the United States that they were to be seeking.
Evelyn Farkas, Colonel Vindman says he's not the whistleblower, doesn't know who the whistleblower is. But it is possible that Colonel Vindman might be one of the people who shared his concerns about this situation with the person who turned out to decide to become the whistleblower.
Right. It sounds highly likely, Lawrence, because he is describing exactly what happened. You know, he describes that he heard the phone call. He was alarmed. He spoke to people about his alarm. He likely spoke to the whistleblower. He probably has a sense of who the whistleblower is, but he doesn't want to, you know, put that person in jeopardy by revealing anything about them. But he expressed his consternation. It's a small group of people. You know, these are all experts who work very hard. You know, as Ambassador McFaul just said, they work very hard to help, you know, the relationship between the United States and Ukraine. And in the case of Ukraine, because it's so pivotal to standing up against Russia, we focus really and put a lot of heart in it, even if you're not Ukrainian American. But of course, that was a special element that he had. The other thing about him, I think, is a military officer. He stresses it over and over again, this duty that he has to speak out and report up the chain if he sees something awry. And it's something that we don't drill into civilians regularly. But in the military, you're not really required, or you're not expected to resign. You're expected to follow orders, but you're also expected to speak out and elevate concerns up the chain.
And Jonathan Alter, it seems like every other day there's a new name who suddenly becomes the most important name so far. And Colonel Vindman is the first person to testify who heard the phone call.
Absolutely. And, you know, history is going to look back on this as part of what I call the patriotic surge. It's now no longer, you know, just one or two ambassadors. You now have more than a half a dozen patriotic Americans coming forward, doing their constitutional duty. These are our heroes now, and I think they will be seen as such when the history of impeachment is written. And in this case, you have somebody not only who was on the call, but was in the military. Ambassador Taylor was in Vietnam. He was in Iraq, and he got a Purple Heart, Vindman did, after being wounded in Iraq. It's going to be very hard for Donald Trump to rip him apart when he testifies in public, which is coming, if not next week, then the week after. And
Ambassador Taylor did testify to some things that were his direct evidence, things that he was conversations he participated in. But a certain amount of his testimony was hearsay. A certain amount of most of the whistleblowers' complaint is what you would call hearsay. Many Republicans, like Lindsey Graham, have been dismissing that kind of evidence as hearsay. But Colonel Vindman is not a hearsay witness. He literally was on the phone call, and he also had his own direct conversations with Gordon Sondland. And I just want to emphasize this passage of his opening statement, because Gordon Sondland is now the person in most jeopardy in terms of what's happened in the investigation in the committee so far. He is the one person who may be close to a perjury charge. Colonel Vindman's opening statement says, Ambassador Sondland started to speak about Ukraine delivering specific investigations in order to secure the meeting with the president, at which time Ambassador Bolton cut the meeting short. That was a meeting with Ukrainian officials. Following this meeting, there was a scheduled debriefing during which Ambassador Sondland emphasized the importance that Ukraine deliver the investigations into the 2016 election, the Bidens and Burisma, I stated to Ambassador Sondland that his statements were inappropriate, that the request to investigate Biden and his son had nothing to do with national security, and that such investigations were not something the NSC was going to get involved in or push. Dr. Fiona Hill then entered the room and asserted to Ambassador Sondland that his statements were inappropriate. Following the debriefing meeting, I reported my concerns to the NSC's lead counsel. Dr. Hill also reported the incident to the NSC's lead counsel. And Ambassador McFaul, this is a kind of scene that I'm sure does not surprise you at all, except for the Sondland part, but the part where the professionals stand up to this, in effect, tourist ambassador, this rich guy who bought his ambassadorship based on no experience whatsoever. That's what you'd expect them to do with an amateur like that.
Well, yeah, normally professionals like Colonel Vindman would never even interact with those kinds of ambassadors. Remember, Sondland had nothing to do with Ukraine policy. He bought his position to be the ambassador to the European Union. And remember, at the time when he's working at the NSC, his job is to be the point person for the entire government at his level for Ukraine. Right? So he is reporting to Fiona Hill, who's the senior director. He's the director for Ukraine. So he has primary responsibility for coordinating the entire policy. And that's why he's so upset when he sees this, as his boss called it, drug deal happening in parallel. And what you read, Lawrence, that sounds like a patriot to me. There is going to be, I challenge anybody to go after Colonel Vindman the way they did with Ambassador Taylor when they called him some radical, unelected bureaucrat. This sounds like a patriot to me, as was and as is Ambassador Taylor, somebody I also know.
Well, because he's also an immigrant, we can expect Donald Trump to accuse him of being biased in favor of Ukraine. And Josh Lederman, Colonel Vindman is very well known in Ukraine. He speaks the language. He is someone who has his own real experience there. And I assume he's someone who the government in Ukraine has dealt with extensively.
That's right. So he was a foreign area expert, which means that even though he served in some different capacities, he's currently detailed to the National Security Council. He's been focused on this region for quite a while. He had served here in Kiev as well as other parts of the broader region. And so he was well known to people here, had a level of trust. They knew who he was and what he stood for, the fact that he was someone who also had ancestry here. And he's someone that has added credibility as a result of the fact that he's a real expert in his area, not someone, as you mentioned, like Ambassador Sondland, who kind of came in and seemed to be acting out of political purposes instead of a well-versed knowledge of U.S. national security interests when it comes to Ukraine and the broader Europe region.
And Evelyn Farkas, the National Security Council's lawyer, is now a very sharp focus of this investigation. Whenever something like this happens, the professionals immediately report it to the NSC's counsel.
Right. And so now the question is, what did that counsel do with the information? And what was the conversation like between Ambassador Bolton, the national security advisor, and the lawyer for the National Security Council? There are a lot of questions about what the lawyer's involvement was in basically taking phone transcripts and putting them onto the very secret computers, which you've talked about in other programs. This lawyer is also potentially, I would say, in some jeopardy. So he can join Ambassador Sondland in that arena. But certainly Sondland, of course, is in a bit of trouble because it looks like he may have misled Congress when he went up to testify.
And Jonathan Alter, to stress to the audience, since the Republicans have been lying about this, tomorrow's deposition there's 48 Republican members of the House who have a right to be in that deposition, listen to every word, and ask every question they might want to ask of Colonel Vindman. There are Republican staff members in that room. And so this is their chance to talk, their first chance to talk to someone who actually listened to the Trump phone call.
Yeah, and I don't think they're going to do anything to knock him down. There's no indication that the Republicans have laid a glove on any of these other people being deposed. They know that their president is in a pickle. And what they're eventually, a lot of them are going to do is just say, well, this doesn't rise to the level of impeachment. They're not even going to try to contest the facts, which are now very clear. The problem with the argument that is emerging that this doesn't rise to the level of impeachment is that it has now become a national security issue. And this is one of the things that Colonel Vindman does, is he links up why this is related to our national security. And the reason that Ukraine did not want to be put in this position is that if their aid was politicized, if it became a Democrat versus Republican thing, because, say, the Democrats thought, well, Ukraine is investigating Joe Biden on a bogus charge, then it would be less likely that they would get aid in the future, less likely that they would be able to defend themselves against Russia. And that is very much in our national security interest. That's why we're giving them $400 million, is that this is a national security issue for us. And this is now become enmeshed in this case.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.